Okay, so good morning and welcome back. We are now beginning with a slight delay our first panel on island narratives. Because of that, I will ask you to bear with me and I will take a few minutes to our coffee break. Hope you will forgive me. It will be worth it, I'm sure, because we have three very interesting presentations on our panel. We will have Edgardo Medeiros da Silva, from ISCSP. Edgardo is an assistant professor of English at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Lisbon and a researcher with ULISSES, the University of Lisbon Center for English Studies. His research interests revolve around American political history and culture, Luso-American relations, and the writings of Harry Adams. He's a fellow of the Salzburg Global Seminar on American Studies and a member of the Portuguese Association for Anglo-American Studies, and he will be presenting on the Azores, the Western Islands, or the Eastern Islands, on the European Grand Tour of William Hickling Prescott between 1815 and 1817. Edgar, thank you so much for being here. I will give you 15 minutes and I will let you know when the time is up.
Okay. I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, but I understand. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. It's in fact the first time that I'm, as an academic, taking part in an event such as this on my own, place of birth, though I'm Michelin's. But still, it's great to be here. So I'll try to make this as quick and short as possible. And I'll focus on, in fact, on the diary of this young man. And I'll skip the theoretical bits to make this as, perhaps lighter, quicker, and more interesting for you. William Hickling Prescott. I came across this individual when, because I do work on American historiography as well. And by chance, I saw this name, Hickling, and of course, Thomas Hickling, as we all know, is connected with San Miguel as vice consul, throughout most of the 19th century, and his son as well, the Dabney family in Horta Fayal and the Hicklings in San Miguel are two names we associate with the American, presence on these islands. So, from very early on, I have to go this way. Okay. From very early on in United States history, the islands of the Azores have served as a meeting point for Portuguese and American culture. There being abundant examples of instances where English, Americans, and Azorians have crossed paths in the North Atlantic basin. Communications between the United States and the Western Islands, or the Wine Islands, as the Azores were also referred to in early Anglo-American texts, date back to the Revolutionary War, when the Continental Congress maintained contact with the Azores in order to coordinate the travel of its emissaries to Europe to get support for the independence movement. Here we have a map there with a reference there of the Western Islands, not the Azores. Because of its strategic location along trade routes between North America and Europe, there have been American diplomatic representatives in the Azores since 1795, the year George Washington appointed John Street as U.S. consul for the islands, based in Horta Fayal, and Thomas Hickling, the grandfather of the New England literary historian William Hickling Prescott, the subject of this presentation, vice consul based in Ponte Delgado, San Miguel. Consular files include data on the role played by the Western Islands in key moments in American history and culture, the War of 1812, the Civil War, New England's whaling industry, as well as the California gold rush and emigration to Hawaii in the late 19th century. Though filtered through the eyes of a foreigner, the above-mentioned William Hickling Prescott left us a fascinating account of his 6-month stay in San Miguel in his travel diary and letters, made in the context of his European Grand Tour, with details about the island, the local people, the scenery, but above all, the vegetation and plant life he encountered during his island perambulations. His observations and comments allow us to better understand, in phenomenological terms, how nature, island space, and island aesthetics associated with the Azores impacted on the senses of this 19-year-old American. I have a picture here. Here he is, probably in his late 20s, early 30s. Although his stay in San Miguel only lasted 6 months, and despite a serious eye condition, Prescott's observations help us to find the contours of the cultural geography of the North Atlantic in the period under consideration. They widen our knowledge of the processes of acculturation and transculturation, which occur in contact zones, places which are characterized, in Mary Louise Pratt's words, by, and I quote, co-presence, interaction, interlocking understandings and practices, and often within radical asymmetrical relations of power. In these contact zone, subjects get constituted in and by their association to each other. The relations established therein among colonizers and colonized, or travelers and travelees, treated not in terms of separateness of difference, but rather in terms of connectedness and exchange. Islands, the Azores included, and I quote, have long been at the crossroads of human cultural interaction and operate as hybrid spaces for identity formation, intangible heritage, and global interconnectivity. Borrowing William Bower's expression, this idea of sites of memory, testimony to processes associated with trade, capital flows, diasporas, and not to mention, of course, piracy and slavery. One of the earliest literary references to the Azores can be found in the journal of John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts Bay, commenting on the Puritan shipmaster Thomas Coyton, who settled in New England in 1638 and was in charge of the maiden voyage of the trial to the Azores and West Indies in 1642. Winthrop writes that on the island of Fayal, Coytman found, and I quote, an extraordinary good market for his pipe staves and fish, which he traded for wine and sugar. Moreover, it is estimated that by the 19th century, and I quote, no less than 3,500 vessels were engaged annually in the Atlantic wine trade, many of whom out from 6 nations, to the Azores and the Canaries, where they took on cargo for delivery in 104 ports in Europe, Africa, North and South America. Drawing on two major sources of information, the travel diary of Prescott, which he kept during his 2-year European Grand Tour, which exists in manuscript form at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the extant correspondence with George Ticknor. Here are the primary sources. George Ticknor, a fellow scholar and friend, transcribed in his Life of William Hickling Prescott, published in 1864, I propose to examine in this paper what his young American had to say about San Miguel and its people in the context of his European Grand Tour through the European continent. In fact, the two main reasons account for Prescott's visit to San Miguel following graduation from Harvard College with a law degree. The first of these, as I've said, had to do with was common practice in the Anglophone world. Prescott embarked on a grand tour of continental Europe in order to visit the sites of ancient Greece and Rome so as to complete his formal education. The study of Greek and Latin, as we know, were the hallmark of the liberal education received by young men of well-off families at institutions of higher learning in both Great Britain and USA at the time. As such, touring Europe and the major sites of Greco-Roman culture became a sort of rite of passage into adulthood in those countries from the mid-19th century onwards, before a young man could embrace a professional career or start a family. The second reason had to do with the fact that during his last year at college, Prescott had been hit by a breadcrumb thrown by a fellow student, which led to serious eye problems throughout his entire life. Eventually, he lost the eyesight in his left eye completely and the other partially. The voyage to the Azores was thus an attempt to mitigate this eye condition by avoiding the harshness of Boston winters, as well as an opportunity to see his grandfather, the above-mentioned Thomas Hickling, whom we suspect he had never met. I'll skip some bits here. Prescott's travel diary covers a total of 185 pages. The first entry, dated September 26, 1815, refers to his departure from Boston, the last one to his embarking from Brighton, England, on May the 14th, 1817, back to the United States. Let me here move on a little bit. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I give you the right and the most interesting bits. Some observations then he made about the Azores. He left for San Miguel in the aftermath of the War of 1812, best known as the Second War of Independence of the United States. He sailed from Boston on September the 26th, 1815, on board the U.S. brigantine Legal Tender, commanded by Captain Lindsay, a small vessel similar to the ones that were used to carry the trade with the Western Islands. After a rough passage, which is how he describes it, with some strong gales and headwinds, he landed at Ponta Delgada, written as Ponta Delgada. And here I have this first page of his travel diary, which you can see there, Ponta Delgada, two separate words. After a 22-day voyage with good weather, the voyage would have normally taken approximately 10 days. In the first letter, he sends his parents, dated November the 13th, 1815, and written by the hand of his half-aunt due to the eye inflammation which had afflicted him during the voyage. Prescott describes the sea crossing as long and uncomfortable, with poor meals being served on board, essentially, and I quote, a diet of rye pudding with no sauce but coarse salt, and in the company of bedbugs and supporters of the Democratic Party. This is the old Democratic Party, not today's Democratic Party. His first impressions upon his arrival in San Miguel Island could not have been better, though in note form, he jotted down in his diary fine marine views, houses with white lime and lava, streets narrow. At his grandfather's home in Rosto do Cão, a suburb of Ponta Delgada, he added, Rosto do Cão, charming garden I have here a picture. This is Rosto do Cão, the house of Thomas Hickling. Those of you who know Ponta Delgada, this is a well-known, ruin. And then, so he writes he says, Rosto do Cão, charming garden of my grandfather, exotics of every description, fire trees, oranges, lemons, citrus trees, pomegranates, tropian flowers, plants, etc., etc., etc. And here is the home and another bit here. And I can tell you that about 2 or 3 years ago, it was on sale for 2 million euros. So, I don't know if it has been sold in between. The day after his arrival, he toured the outskirts of Ponta Delgada with Amelia, his half-aunt, noting in his diary, wrote with Amelia to Feijão, spelled in odd way. High stone walls obstructed the prospect, cottages without windows, fireplaces or comforts. In the previously mentioned letter to his parents, he describes the capital of the island as picturesque, charming, closer to fiction than to reality, affirming that the town is located at the foot of hills surrounded by yellow fields of corn, which contrast with the whiteness of the buildings and the picturesque turrets of the innumerable convents that could be seen. So much so that the whole setting created in him an admirer of nature, but not of the excesses of feeling associated with romantic poetry, as he puts it, and I quote, a coup d'oeil on which the genius of a Radcliffe, or indeed anyone, much less an admirer of the beauties of nature than myself, might expend a folio of sentimentality and nonsense. That's interesting what he has to say about romantic poetry here. And then, and I quote, blessed little island is how he describes San Miguel in that first letter to his parents, dated November the 13th, 1815. A place of mild winters and chilly summers, but where the weather is capricious, quote, making the local inhabitants, and I quote, absolutely amphibious. And I quote again, if they, the local inhabitants, are in sunshine one half of the day, they are sure to be in water the other half. End of quote. The exuberance of the vegetation, almost tropical, the air perfumed by laurel, myrtle, and orange trees drew immediately Prescott's attention, used that he was to the inhospitable climate of New England. If the fables about Hesperia had been true, they could have only happened on this island. He notes at one point. In the references he makes to his donkey rides through the countryside, the best means of transportation on the island, he underscores the novelty of the landscape and the vegetation, astonished to see in open air, in size and perfection that no artificial heat could ever make blossom, plants he had only seen, in greenhouses. He wanders as he writes through forests of boxwood, cypresses, and myrtle, feeling as if he had been transported to the age of Horace and Anacreon. Though the Azores are located only a few miles south of Boston, he observes in a letter to his friend and future editor, William Howard Gardiner, son of his old professor of Latin and Greek before entering Harvard, there's no other place in the face of the earth where the amenity of a healthy climate is so propitious to vegetation. Skip a little bit here. I'm okay.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay.
Until the 15.
Until 15. Okay. And the next 2 or 3. All right. Let me just skip then and move on to the issue of oranges in San Miguel, which is an important question. So visits and excursions to gardens and orangeries in a possible allusion to Louis XIV's Versailles orange grove featured repeatedly in Prescott's account of San Miguel. One in particular on October the 19th, 1815, refers to a visit to the garden of one of his grandfather's local acquaintances. And I quote, "Walk to Dona Ana Rosa's garden, the finest on the island, delicious orange groves, box and myrtles, 20 feet in height." Oranges, a much cherished exotic fruit among European upper classes, were to play an important role in the economy of San Miguel throughout most of the 19th century. As recent studies have shown, it was the foreign residents on the island, Prescott's grandfather included, who first took advantage of the lucrative business of exporting citrus fruits, oranges for the most part, to the markets of Northern Europe before the stiff competition of oranges from Spain, Sicily, and mainland Portugal. One of the entries in Prescott's diary sheds light on the economic importance of this business activity. February the 15th, 1816, excursion to Doctor's Quintas, delicious orange groves. Good orange trees average 4,000 to 5,000 oranges annually. 20,000 have been known. Prices of oranges range formerly from 10 cents per 1,000, now $6 or even $9. But property on the island yields 8 to 9%, end of quote. I'll skip also, what I have here about this activity and other references in other sources, primary sources to the business of exporting oranges to England for the most part, and say a few things here about the visits that he makes to different, convents and monasteries on the island, because that's one of his most interesting bits in the diary, which has to do, of course, with his own perspective of being a Protestant as far as religion is concerned. He visits at one point, so as I said, these innumerable convents, and it is in the context of these visits that he reveals his Protestant biases with respect to the followers of Catholicism. When pointing out in his correspondence the contrast between the cornfields surrounding the town of Ponte Delgado and the whiteness of the turrets of these convents, innumerable convents, as he says in one of the letters, Prescott does not refrain from commenting to his parents in one of the letters that they both, and I quote, beautify and disgrace the city, corroborating a long tradition in the Anglophone world, going back to the Protestants' Reformation, which tended to equate Catholic convents with places of ill repute. In the letter he sends to his friend Gardiner, which is the quotation you have up there, he writes that Catholic convents do not correspond to the romantic idea people have of these places as places of purity and simplicity, noting, and there you have the quote, it looks as if all nuns had a boyfriend, outside the convent. Additionally, as an American raised within the strictures of New England Protestantism, Prescott also finds it hard to understand the behavior of Catholics. How can one explain, he observes to his sister Catherine, that when a poor man loses a child, everyone congratulates him. But when that very same man loses a pig, everyone tries to console him, implying that the local people attribute more importance to the material loss than to human life. Anyway, the diary and the letters are full of this, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, etc., perspective. As to the local population, there are very few references. That's an interesting point. There's a very interesting references also in the diary to going to the Valley of Furnas, because Thomas Hickling, as you know, is connected with the founding of the Parque Terra Nostra. That was his garden where he took visitors when they came to visit the island. He would, and he took. So we have a description of his journey all the way from Punta Delgada on a donkey all the way to the valley. So it's also fascinating stuff, but unfortunately we don't have the time to go through that. But let me just finish up with a little conclusion here, to say that after his grand tour, he returned, of course, to Boston. And what I can say as a conclusion is Prescott never forgot that fierce attack of 1815, because halfway through his stay there, his eye condition worsened terribly, and he had to remain indoors for a period of about 2 or 3 months without going outside. So that was it. So this is that fierce attack. 3 months he spent inside this dark room in his father's home in San Miguel. Had he not been affected by this serious eye problems, I'm sure we would have, of course, a much fuller picture of San Miguel, its people, living conditions, etc. Despite his oftentimes biased stereotypical descriptions, nonetheless, these observations that left us concerning this particular contact zone, a fluid space of interaction and exchange allow us to define, as I said, with more propriety, some of the contours of this cultural geography, confirming the fact that in the outer words of Bollhauer, who is somebody connected with Atlantic studies, and this new Atlantic, matrix, as he said, as individuals travel across borders, areas, and continents, their entanglements can offer keen personal insights into the world around them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edgardo. I'm really, really sorry for having to rush you like this. I feel like a very rude person, but I don't have any other choice. I will very quickly give the floor to Andrea Vacha. Andrea holds a master's degree in sociology from the Università degli Studi di Torino, and a master's degree in management of development from the ITC ILO from ILO. In 2014, he worked as a project manager for NGO in Chibuto, Mozambique. That's when he became interested in the history of the Gaza Kingdom. During 2022, he was a guest student at the Pedagogical University of Maputo and at ERPAC, Mozambique's Social Cultural Research Institute. He's currently a PhD candidate in contemporary history at ISCTE UL in Lisbon and an FCT scholarship holder. Andrea will be presenting on Imagined Elsewhere through Gungunhana, representations of the exiled king in the Azores and Mozambique. Thank you so much, Andrea. I'll give you 15 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. Can I use the... Good morning, everybody. It's thanks. It's a big pleasure to be here, and it's my sorry. It's my first time in Santa Maria. I would like to thank you for being here. I would like to thank LPAZ committee and everybody who works for making this possible. And especially I would like to thank Anna Monica and Antonio for giving me the chance to be here, because this communication, it really means something to me. It's somehow a way to close a circle that began last year in Maputo. in 2022, I was doing a presentation in Maputo University, and for a chance, it was the day afterwards that the half bust of representing Gungunhana in Ilha Terceira was unveiled, and this, I could tell this to the students, and I really felt a great interest and curiosity, and really amazed me how the reaction of the students. So it was really important to bring this feedback back here to Azores, even though it's not the same island, but it was really important for me doing that. I would like to start my presentation quoting a director. It's called Mosco Canwedo, from Zimbabwean origin, that recorded a documentary called Forgotten Royalties. And during this, he presented this documentary, recalling when his grandmother used to tell him fairy tales about an exiled king in a faraway white man land. And when he was a student, he tried to find out information in the textbooks about this, but he could not. And so somehow, until he grew up, we thought it was a kind of myth. So this is somehow what is about is the exile and the imprisonment and the exile of King Gungunhana and three companions in Azores, has often been a source of inspiration, of imagination. And this is a process that goes both ways. For the Azorean people at the time, we have articles of the newspaper like now. The prisoners reminds of savage kingdom in the heart of Africa. At the same time, what I could experience, students in Mozambique nowadays have very little information about the exile part of this story in the textbooks and in the school material. Even though Gungunhana plays a major role in Mozambican history. So yes, I would like to give some hints of this process. Maybe before we just need to step back to some of the timeline of this of the events. So we have to go back to the mid 19th century when Gungunhana was born in the Kingdom of Gaza. Kingdom of Gaza was a huge, powerful kingdom. It was the second largest in Africa at the time, and the king was Gungunhana rose to the throne in 1884, the same year of the Berlin Conference and the scramble of Africa. And sorry, he was able to move very, very well in this tense political environment, playing a double game between the formal Portuguese authorities and the British, namely Cecil Rhodes, that was in the neighbor Transvaal. he played so well this game that the Portuguese crown has no other option that move direct war, a war that was very dangerous and costly, especially in a time in which the state was in a severe economic crisis. The Portuguese army managed to overcome and to defeat the Gungunhana and the state of Gaza, bringing back to Lisbon the king, 4 wives of him, and 3 other companions, and other 3 wives of these other companions. So it was a huge show, let's say, made up to gain popularity for the monarchy. But it didn't turn well, because the society, the most conservative part of the society at the time, reacted badly. Well, in a sense, well, because there was a lot of euphoria, but in the other sense, badly, because the polygamy, a show to experience polygamy so close was a big shock and a big scandal. So the solution found was to separate males and women, and the queens were sent to Santo Tomé Príncipe, and the men to Ilha Terceira, to Angra do Heroísmo, where they found they received what was called the civilization mission, receiving the sacraments, the literacy, and even the Catholic names. So that in 1906, Gungunhana died as Reginaldo Gungunhana. 19 years afterwards, and this is very interesting. Just by the way, it's interesting that his life is divided completely in 2. It's like 11 years on the throne and 11 years in exile. But in 19 years afterwards, Samora Machel, the first Mozambican president, revindicated the mortal remains in a process that was somehow controversial, to come back to Maputo, and they were welcomed by a huge crowd in an apotheotic ceremony. And this ceremony really had a huge impact in what was the artistic production of Mozambique for the years to come. Well, just here there are some works that inspired me about this presentation, but I probably will skip most of all. Just a quick highlights about the way we will use the word diaspora, maybe not in its most used biblical way, but mostly in its original roots as seeds blown by the wind. So it was the 30th of June, 1896, when these 4 African kings, it was the king, the official heir, and the other 2 chiefs arrived to the port of Angra do Heroísmo. And these are the words with which the local newspaper, União, described. I will just translate some part roughly, but basically says, imagine, if you can, this man grown up in a wild nature, surrounded by huge territory. Imagine, if you can, the sorrow that they must feel being locked in a sad cell. And I managed to meet savages, but they were not. And the article goes on stating that what is different from them is just the color of the skin. This is kind of remarkable statement because at the time scientific racism was kind of mainstream, so it shows a great empathy with the prisoner, much more that what was how they have been welcomed in mainland in Lisbon. The other little picture you see down there is a postcard. There is a series of postcards printed in Angra de Heroismo, sold for touristic purposes, documenting the mission of Christianization and civilization, so-called. The other one, it's from the other side, from Maputo, 90 years afterwards, when the mortal remains came back. This is the revista, the Tempo. It's one of the main Mozambican journals, and it's a photo reportage of the Azores in 1985. Since then, a bunch of books and novels have been published. Especially the first, Walalap, it's very important. It's from Ungulani Balakos. It's considered one of the 100 African novels most important of the 20th century. And of course, there are also renowned names as Paulina Cisiane and others. We picked two. We picked two of them. Just a little resume. One is this book. Is from Miyakoto that doesn't need much introduction. It's the most well-known living writer from Mozambique. He wrote a trilogy that is called The Sands of the Emperor. And in this trilogy, the main, all the characters are somehow experiencing, for different reasons, a diaspora. And the last book, in the first two books, Gungunhana doesn't appear much, but in the third book, is basically all about him, because he's experiencing the most severe kind of diaspora imaginable, because for the Nguni culture, the sea was a taboo, and especially, and even they could not eat fish. So being locked and exiled in an island surrounded by water was an increase, was like a double punishment, let's say. And the solution, or the escape for this, was only to drink until basically faint. That's why the drinker of Orizer. So okay, yeah. The other one, it's another. It's a very interesting novel. It's a short novel that goes the way around. So it's basically it starts in the author. It's Marcelo Panguana, recently won the most important prize of for writers in Mozambique. And the novel starts in the graveyard of Angra de Heroismo, where the ghost of Gungunhana have to fly back to Maputo, and he found himself in a city, a modern city that it's completely new to him, in which nobody recognized him, and somehow he feels completely lost and fragmented then between what is between different times and space. Just a very, very quick look at the iconography now. During the commemoration of the 125th years of the imprisonment, some artistic works were done. So the first one is a graffiti in Manjakatse. Manjakatse was the capital of Gaza Kingdom, so the cradle of the Nguni culture. And it's somehow surprising that the picture chosen was an original picture from the mission, the civilization mission of Azores. The second one, it's a full-length statue unveiled in 2021 with at the base some lines talking about Azores. And the last one is the one that somehow inspired a little bit this communication because it's the half bust that was unveiled in Angradorismo last year, and actually you can see through the statue looking far away above the sea, somehow reminding these nostalgic feelings. So please allow me just a few conclusions. Well, basically, as this commemoration showed, there is a bridge, ideal bridge that is connecting Mozambique to Azores, and the pillar of this bridge is this man, Gungunhana. Yeah, one thing that I think is that this kind of fiction somehow fill the gaps. If you see, this is a book that it's used in schools beside the manuals, and it has just one page about the exile. So the student doesn't have much rooms, but the novels are here for giving somehow flesh to the bones. We talk about a specific kind of diaspora because it's about a royal family, and also it's coming from a very far away place to another very far away place. It doesn't follow a common pattern, the going from center to periphery or other way around. And what is missing, it's now some audiovisuals. I didn't find any music or even the documentary we mentioned at the very beginning it was not released in the end because of problems connected to pandemic. So if in the audience there are musicians or directors, it's an invitation. And just let me just conclude saying that somehow this is an example that in Mozambique at least turned very much as an archetype of an exile, and somehow in this diasporic context, imagination plays somehow a big role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. With no further ado, I will give the floor to Timothy Dale Walker from UMass Dartmouth. Timothy, you are going to speak from that side, so if someone could help us while I'm presenting Timothy. So Timothy is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, where he serves on the executive board of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture. He's a scholar of maritime history, colonial overseas expansion, and transoceanic slave trading, and he is affiliated research at the Centro de História de Aquém e de Além-Mar, CEM, from Nova University of Lisbon. In 2019, I'm going to skip his bio. You'll see he's a a full scholar with a full career already. So you have the whole information on the file on the website. So very quickly, in 2019, Timothy Walker was appointed a guest investigator at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, drawing historic climate data from archive whaling logbooks, Portuguese colonial and other maritime documentation. He has taught maritime history abroad, and he's a contributing faculty member of the Manson Institute of Maritime Studies and director of the National Endowment for Humanities Landmarks in American History workshop series titled Sailing to Freedom, New Bedford and the Underground Railroad between 2011 and 2022. Timothy, thank you so much. He will be presenting on assessing historic change to weather in the Atlantic Ocean using Portuguese and American maritime archival sources in the long term between 1750 and 1950. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank the organizers and all of the entities that gave support so that this could happen. It's a fantastic opportunity to have this transatlantic conversation and this and to really underscore the importance of the Azores in this Atlantic world that I think comes home to us as we're here in a way that we wouldn't get in our home countries. So I want to tell you very quickly about a project that I'm working on. We've been hearing a lot about history today, and this draws on historical documentation from the same period, but it's used for a very modern and indeed future purpose, and that is to use historical documentation from ship logbooks, diários de bordo, to inform climate research. And what we have is a marriage, if you will, between two very different fields, different disciplines, and two very different skill sets, that of a historian in the humanities and that of scientific researchers on the climate at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and at Portuguese institutions in Lisbon, with which we've partnered to create an international science and humanities project drawing on these records to inform climate science. Logbooks, diários de bordo, diários náuticos, these are documents that go back centuries. And what they have, which historians knew, but often scientists didn't know, was that they are recording every day, typically multiple times a day, the weather conditions in the areas where they were passing. And there were two major groups of documentation that had not been used by scientists. I should quickly say, this is not a new idea. There are other groups that have used ocean logbooks before, but they're using them from the French and the English. What they hadn't drawn on were collections that fill in the gaps in the globe in terms of temperature and weather that those English and French and Spanish documentation didn't fill in. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. These are my colleagues in Portugal, Enrique Leitão, who's at FCUL, and also Ricardo Trigo. And my colleague at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is Caroline Umenhofer. Some of you may know very well the curriculum of these fine colleagues. They're some of the top scientists and historians functioning in Portugal, and also my colleague at Woods Hole is one of the top climate scientists in the United States. So we have the pessoas certas to work on this project, and I'm very happy to be the sort of humble historian who's merely giving the information to the experts who use it for climate modeling, right? So all sailing vessels that left North America from the region where I'm from in Massachusetts and Nantucket and Long Island, because of the wind and current patterns in the Atlantic, they had to come through the Azores. And so we started using whaling records, baleeiros, that were going after the whales in the North Atlantic because they are recording the weather data in the Atlantic, but also in other parts of the world. And our initial project focused mainly on the collections of these whalers, of which most of the logbooks exist literally in my backyard. They were within 200 meters of where I was living, was the largest collection of logbooks in the world, actually two of them for whalers. But we also then expanded quickly because I, as a historian, I had an understanding of the riches of the archives in Portugal as well. And I knew that those archival collections, not only in Lisbon or Belém, but also in other parts of the formerly colonized Portuguese world, Mozambique, for example, or Goa, or Brazil, they also held logbooks that would be tremendously helpful for this project. We focused on the New Bedford and New England whaling industry because it's the best documented industry in the world for these early archives. The Yankee whalers wrote everything down and they kept it. And so we have thousands and thousands of meters of documentation in New Bedford that's useful. What do the logbooks record daily? Well, latitude and longitude, wind direction, wind force or wind speed, the temperature, precipitation, rainfall, storms, weather variations, and sometimes they're taking measurements of currents. And this goes back, the whaling records begin in the late 18th century. So they're beginning in the 1780s to record this information. The Portuguese records go back further, but at least in continental Portugal, you get very few records prior to the earthquake, because 1755 destroyed a lot of the documentation. So most of our records in Portugal begin in about 1760, and those are housed in Belém at the Archival de Marinha. This illustrates, so you see the dark lines, these are the established shipping routes, even for sailing vessels, by the middle of the 17th century. And they're going through the Atlantic and into Asia. But what's really valuable about the whaling records and the Portuguese records is that they do not stay within those established sea lanes. They go much further. So let's look. These are the whaling, this map represents every whale that was taken, captured by the New England whaling industry between 1780 and 1920. And the red dots are cachalotes, they're sperm whales, and the blue dots are either right whales or humpback whales. And so this gives you a sense of the global distribution, not only of the whales, but also of the weather data that these ships collected on a daily basis, multiple times per day. And so the value of this project from the point of view of climate scientists is that this project can provide data that is available nowhere else in the world. And prior to the arrival of weather satellites in the 1980s, they simply cannot get data for most of these very remote sections of the world's oceans. So it's super valuable to climate science. This is a typical logbook from a typical whaling voyage. This is the Abigail that left New Bedford 1831 to 1835, went to 3 of the world's oceans, but they all sail through the Azores, typically down to the Cape Verde Islands and then into the South Atlantic. Now, the Azores have a distinction in climate science because there's a weather pattern around the Azores that climate scientists refer to as the Azores High. You think of it as for non-scientists such as myself, think of it as a mountain of weather that influences all the weather around it, including most of Western Europe. And so understanding the weather around the Azores in this weather zone called the Azores High is absolutely important for understanding how that weather influences other parts of the world, particularly Western Europe and North Africa. So the weather data that we're gathering from these logbooks helps scientists to understand and to model weather patterns in the North Atlantic, but we're also using it for other parts of the world. Our initial data collection focused mainly on the Azores, but also on voyages that went around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, because the Indian Ocean weather patterns, which are changing enormously now, the arrival of the monsoons in the Indian Ocean influences rain that is absolutely important for 1/3 of the world's population around the Indian Ocean rim and in Australia. So these are areas that we need to look at as well. We also need to, why didn't that not advance? There we go. So most of the data is given in qualitative terms. They're describing the weather. They don't have instruments. And so they say, fresh breeze or moderate breeze or gentle breeze. And we have to translate that into a quantitative value for modern science to use. Well, this is the Beaufort wind scale, which is developed in 1805 by an Anglo-Irish captain named Beaufort. And we can use this then to, it's not perfectly precise. There are modern scientists who would like to see a more precise reading, but this is as good as we're going to get. And it's better than absolutely nothing at all, which is what we have if we don't do this kind of research. One other point, let me just jump backwards for a second. A point about these logbooks. They cannot be read by machines. You can't scan them with a computer and then extract the data. You have to do this the old way, with human beings who are trained in paleography, who understand the nautical jargon, the nautical language. So we have trained researchers who are looking at these. Oh, and by the way, most of these logbooks are not digitized at all. So some of them are, but mostly we have to actually go into archives and read them, the original documents. This is true in Portugal, where the entire collections of the Portuguese Navy are not digitized. And only a couple of repositories in the United States have digitized their logbook collections. One of our objectives is to get these logbooks digitized so that they can be used by scientists anywhere in the world. So I'll go very quickly. I know I don't have a lot of time. We look for instances where two whalers or two Portuguese ships are traveling together or where they cross paths. Because where they cross paths, then we can check the consistency of how they are recording weather data. And so it's interesting here. Here's a flag hoist, a signal that asks, what is your longitude? In other words, they're trying to check where they thought each ship was, because they're using very primitive methods, a chronometer, a watch, to check where their longitude is. So they're using an opportunity of ships passing in the night, if you will, to double check their position and their location, to check their navigation. How many logbooks are we talking about? Well, the New Bedford Whaling Museum has 2,500. The Nantucket Historical Association has 400. New Bedford Free Public Library has 500. So there are 3,000 in New Bedford. Providence Public Library has 800 that represent 1,000 voyages. And Mystic Seaport has 250. So all of these 5 collections are within an hour or hour and a half of New Bedford. And this is 80% of all known whaling logbooks that we can draw on. Now, let's talk about Portuguese records, because the Portuguese records are really adding to and augmenting our ability to tell something interesting about the weather in various parts of the world. Of course, there's some of the earliest logbooks. There are older ones that exist in colonial archives that we can use in Mozambique and in Goa. But how many do we have? Now, these slides are made for an audience that doesn't know Portugal very well. But when I show my American colleagues how broad Portuguese navigational understanding was, many of them are astonished. But I always want to just underscore, we saw where the whalers went. Look at where the Portuguese went. They're everywhere. And so the logbooks of the Portuguese are also in a very special position to be able to fill in weather data where other voyages don't. This is from one of the early works on the islands of the Atlantic, Duncan's book, but it talks about the Portuguese shipping and trade routes in the Atlantic. And so these gives us an indication of where the weather data will show up from logbooks that are from merchant and military ships traveling in the Atlantic from the Portuguese. In terms of international trade routes, the Portuguese can also help us fill in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea and the area around modern-day Indonesia. They are recording weather in places that other navies and other merchant ships are not. Of course, the Portuguese give us weather information also from the South Indian Ocean and the South Atlantic. I don't have a good map for that. But it also gives us a sense of where ships are going. So let me show you some examples. This is the archive of the Portuguese Navy in Belém. It's the old Cordoria Nacional. If you've ever seen the original Raiders of the Lost Ark film, the last scene where they open a government warehouse and it just goes on for miles and miles. That's what this archive looks like. You go into the long, long rooms that were made for making rope or cordage, and they're just full of Navy records that seem to go for kilometers and kilometers. And but they have literally thousands. So how many do we have? About 2,200 or 2,400 logbooks from the Portuguese Navy going from the 1760s to the 1960s. And this is super valuable for filling in where the whalers stop. One other point about these dates. 1750 is more or less the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So if you want to track weather change for the period of time when carbon is coming into the world's atmosphere, these are the dates to do it. We have records from the very beginning, sort of pre-industrial, and then we have records right through World War II with the massive expansion of carbon into the world's atmospheres. And so this project can help us to track that. Here are some examples of Portuguese logbooks. The Portuguese Navy logbooks are much better organized than the whalers. The whalers were busy doing other things, capturing whales, but the Portuguese Navy had large tripulações. They had more members of the crew, and so they could keep better records. And they often have hourly or semi-hourly weather reports on Portuguese ships. So this is 1848 between the Cape Verde Islands and Angola. The ship is the Audaz. Here's another one. This is from Maputo in Mozambique. This is another merchant vessel, and from 1877. And you can see that they're in many ways much more detailed and much more organized than the whaling records that we have. And this is the Salvador Correia from Funchal to Fayal in 1895. And the Portuguese logbooks eventually were printed with very easy to read tables of documentation. So these are much easier to use. Just by wrapping up, does it work? We've gone through the proof of concept phase now. We've done over 135 logbooks. We're really kind of at the beginning. The recent COVID events slowed us down because we couldn't get into archives to read the books, but we've gathered data now on almost 85,000 days worth of data. And with that data, our colleagues in the hard sciences are doing pretty serious weather modeling where they can see changes in the Azores high atmospheric zone, changes happening over time, and changes in what's called the Hadley cell, the Hadley circulation, where wind patterns are shifting outward away from the equator towards the poles, where the most violent winds are now in the 50-degree latitude in the southern hemisphere rather than in the 40s, which is what they were about 150 years ago. So we're beginning to see results. We're really only at the tip of the iceberg. So if we've done 130 out of more than about 7,000 total logbooks, this is a long process. It depends on funding, and we're trying to raise more funds so we can hire more researchers so we can gather more data. But our project currently, we're imagining about a 10-year project to get this data into a database where, and my final point will be this, the data is designed to go into pre-existing global databases where this will help scientists anywhere in the world who are working on this. There's a major project at the United Kingdom Meteorological Office, and they have a kind of an umbrella database that coordinates all of this information. So again, my role is mainly as a researcher, but I was particularly well positioned because of my connection in Portugal. I did my postdoc work in Goa, so I know about those archives. And I was able to connect, and I live in New Bedford, so I was able to connect the whaling, the Portuguese, and the colonial archives to gather this data and provide it to the scientists. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Edgardo, Andrea, and Timothy. I really, again, apologize for having to cut the word and having to speed you up. And I know that's very uncomfortable for the ones who are speaking. It's also very uncomfortable for the ones who are doing it. So again, thank you so much for your patience. We are now almost on the time of beginning the second panel. I would really ask you to have a very brief coffee. I don't think we have time for a formal Q&A. I really don't think we should delay even more our program so that we can then keep with the schedule to the lunch and the aftermath. But I do invite you all to pose your questions and dialogue and ask things to our wonderful speakers here. I would ask you to join me in thanking them again for presenting this such interesting perspectives on islands. And I mean, I'm very, very happy to be here again. Thank you so much. Let's have a very brief coffee, 5 minutes, 10 minutes the most, please, so that we can carry on. Thank you so much.